Hey everyone, my name is Akvma, and today I'm going to be breaking down my track, The Revolution, off of my new EP, Neurogenesis, on Disciple. Let's go into the first part. I want to start showing you about the mixing and mastering process of this track. So the reason I want to start there first is because I usually start with a mix and master in mind. The way I usually like to do it is I go into, let's see, I have all my buses sorted here, just like the drums, all my low sounds, my mid sounds, the cymbals and highs, any effects and samples will go up here, and they're all looped back into these audio tracks here, which you can see they have just no input turned on, but they're being sent into these audio tracks here. And I do this bus processing because what I like to do is stuff like tape stop or filtering and stuff, as well as sidechain ducking. Sometimes I'll actually do sidechain ducking on multiple tracks, so I'll actually take this like Duck Buddy here. This is shout out Slink for making this sick sidechain plugin. It's basically a ducking plugin. It's a volume ducker, and you can take the input of any MIDI input from anywhere in Ableton. So in this case I have it from a drum, in this case a kick from phase 1, shout out phase 1, and it's just in the build up here. And you can see it's just slowly ducking the entire bus here, but it's ducking all the buses at once. And I say buses because these are groups up here, like groups of audio, but I work in this pseudo analog way where I take all the audio outputs and I reroute them into a certain analog fashion, where I can then re-level everything out in a certain different way. For example, like on this master bus here, I have grain delay here, and in the automation for that grain delay, I can see I've turned on in just these parts over here. And you can see it creates just a little bit of like smearing to the audio. But it's only in just these small parts of the entire master bus. And you can also see I'm also doing some filter automation here on the master bus, just before the build up to actually increase and lower the low end to increase the, I guess, swell or tension before the drop. And you can see that actually happened here on a spectrum analyzer. You can see the low end starts to dip away. And the overall loudness, the perceived loudness, actually starts to dip, and you can see that relative to this LUFS meter here. And so that's typically how I would bus things together. Another thing I like to use is send and returns. So I have a reverb send here, and the way that you can do it in Ableton is you can create these send channels here. And so I just have send 1, 2, and then a swell channel, which is basically a dynamic reverb channel. And this dynamic reverb channel allows me to send any dry sound into it, and I can control basically the reverb like coming in, essentially. And you can see I have a lot of little mountains and peaks here, and you'll hear that in the drop how it works in context. If I turn it off there and you hear that volume right there, the reverb starts to decay out. That's essentially what this send channel is doing. And any sound that I'm sending into that, which I can go into the sounds here, you can see that I have just this entire group here being sent to group C here, or to send C, which is the swell channel. And so everything comes back into this channel here, and I can automate in the volume of this chain selector right here, which is just a convolver, so I just have some reverb being OTT'd, and there's just a ton of compression and EQ, basically bringing out this reverb. But what I can do with this is, because the reverb is just playing all the time, I don't want the reverb just to be on all the time. I want to dynamically bring it back in and out rhythmically. So I like to bring it into the like the off beats. So you have the main beat right here, beat 1, and then beat 2. I like to call this the off beat. And then on that off beat, I like to make the room become bigger. And so to increase the room size, I like to increase the reverb essentially. But I have that dynamic control, so it snaps back down to 0 instantaneously when another sound comes in, like this sound. A snare, for example. Another useful mixing trick is muting, and I mute a lot of stuff. So you can see here that on a lot of buses, I mute every single bus here. And I do a lot of aggressive, like really fast muting, and that muting creates a lot of like dry moments and a lot of like clean spaces for sounds to come out. And so you have these moments of loudness and quiet in such really short amounts of time. It creates this, I don't know, like intense, anxious experience, so to speak. And you can hear how the muting actually affects the actual rhythmic flow of the track. And you can see that it's essentially just me drawing kind of these emotional roller coasters, I like to call them, in Ableton, where it's just me automating when the reverb comes in, or automating when I turn off a sound or turn on a sound. And it's mostly just simple stuff like that, but really that's essentially how I get a lot of my sounds to sound really big. It's really loud sounds for a really short amount of time, and then a quiet sound for a really short amount of time. And it creates these moments of loudness and quiet, which is kind of a really cool technique for call and response. And that's something I use a lot in my music, and I think a lot of people in bass music and EDM use primarily in a lot of their music. And for my call and response technique, I've been using a really weird trick that I've seen a lot of FL producers do, where they will kind of automate the way that they run their synths and stuff, and also they would work in limited like pattern sizes, and so you have to kind of write everything with MIDI essentially, and it kind of inspired me to like think about my sounds a little differently and layer my sounds in a way that they all play together. You can hear it. You can hear what I'm talking about when all the sounds come together. They can sound like really overlayered, but when you break each sound down, you can hear how each layer builds up. So this is the sub, and the sub by itself, it's pretty simple. It's just a sine wave, I think. Yeah, it's just a sine wave. And I think all I did was did some crazy volume automation to it. Yeah, just some crazy volume automation and some crazy pitch change. And that simple sound right there can be utilized. You know, you can use that clean sine wave, yes, and it's pretty cool, but what if you took the sine wave and pushed it really far? That's pretty cool, but it's really noisy and it kind of takes up a lot of the spectrum here. And we want to kind of fill this spectrum with our own sounds, so what I like to do is I'll come in here and EQ it out, maybe. Take out a huge notch here. Maybe even EQ it a little further and come in here and add some FabFilter dynamic EQ to really like tailor how the sub sounds. And then usually I'll add some noise too. Erosion is a pretty cool plugin to use. And I just stack the erosions, and if you just press and hold Control and drag, or Command on Mac, you can drag and duplicate effects. And so I'll do it here. It might take a little bit to load, but it'll duplicate that effect and its properties, and I essentially just do that. I'll take an effect and just keep duplicating, change the properties of that, set it to something new, and I'll just duplicate that again essentially, and that'll be how I create most of my sounds. The next thing I do is just some more aggressive EQing here. And also my really cool multi-band preset, which is just, it's like kind of like OTT, but it's not the upward expansion of OTT, it's just the downward compression of OTT. So that's just the sub by itself. And we have all these gun sounds up here, which if I solo them, they're not going to play by themselves, but if I play, you can hear this. It's just I think it's just a Dr. Lobster sound. Shout out Dr. Lobster for making really cool sounds. Here you go. Yeah, here it is. I just took like literally just a small section of the sound right here. And I think I also added I think I just added a sub here and ran it through some processing here. Whoops. There we go, that's the sound. So this sound by itself pretty much is just a little grain essentially, but I like working with like essentially small grains that have a lot of formants and stuff, and you can see that there are like a lot of peaks here and a lot of harmonic shapes and stuff that sound very vocally, and I like to work with very like vocally sounds because I like to work with stuff that has very humanistic qualities to them, because people can kind of like mouth it out, or they can kind of like shape it in a way that they can like lyrically understand the song. Next thing I do is I start stacking dispersers. I love disperser. Shout out Kilohertz for making probably the coolest all-pass filter. It just really adjusts those phases. And then I do something really crazy here that probably no one would ever think to do. I just kind of stack all these EQ peaks here to get really weird, just like tonal peaks and stuff. And it also causes really cool transients in the high end here. And then when you run that through a saturator, that's really clipped like hard. Like if I had not EQ'd it in this really odd, bizarre way, it would sound really muddy. And so having increased the really painful regions, I'd actually discovered a really new cool sound having distorted it in this way. And also, if you want to know what these dispersers are now doing, if I turn off the dispersers and then turn them on again, you can hear that it's actually shifting the low end essentially in time. And so when you shift the low end like that, and also shifting it way before the saturator, because everything is serial, and so the dispersers run in this serial type of fashion, they run into the saturator and it causes the low end to clip, but at a way later time. So it's a pretty cool technique if you want to get the little heavy machinery sounds. Next technique is Convolver, probably my most favorite one that I've pretty much seen everyone using lately. And it's probably the most underrated one, and probably the most hardest one to use. I would say the hardest one to use. Because you just need to find the right sample. I usually just use the same sample though, which is bizarre. But you need to find the right convolution IR, and if you want to get into impulse responses and stuff, it's probably the next sound design thing that everyone should be watching out for, because you can put anything into there and make it sound like anything, or make it sound like it's anywhere. The next thing I do is I just add a compressor again, and I just EQ it to make it fit in the mix. And I just start making variations of that sound essentially. So what happens is I will automate and create basically like slight tonal variations in each sound, and each gun here is coming here from a different MIDI channel here. And then of course this MIDI is referencing from the sub channel that you just saw there. And so altogether you get this one sound, which when layered together so all I have to do pretty much now that I have my instrument essentially is just write the MIDI. And so everything from there is basic call and response. And for example, like this sound right here, which if I consolidate for you, you can see how I kind of shifted the MIDI so that it's slightly delayed in time. I like to call it the drunk MIDI, because the MIDI is all off time, but it somehow still works in context of the song. Because you can see that if I adjusted all the MIDI back in time here, oops, if I adjusted it back in time right there, you could still see that it would still be like oddly off time. I do this technique of like drawing off grid to make it sound like it's a physical thing, like it was physically played in by something, to not make it sound like it was completely like drawn in or it was just like an LFO. It gives it some like humanistic quality in a way as well. And also this like delay in time also gives it more weight. I like to call it weight, value, size, dimension. It can give entire atmosphere to a sound just by shifting the notes slightly. And just that little offbeatness creates more size to your sound, and it can give that more heaviness to your sound. But you also like the way I have it timed here, you can see that it's actually it's timed so that it's on every single kick and snare here. So you can see there's a kick, and a snare. And it pretty much ends at that phrase right here. And then it goes into the second phrase, and the second phrase would be the response, which this phrase would be the call. And so you can see it's just all a bunch of mini call and responses, essentially. So we have this one, the one main layer, so the one I like to call it the main riff, essentially. And you can see I have it all grouped like this. So I have the riff here, the counter riff, which is its own group. And the counter riff is just essentially like a little resamples or little offbeats of the main riff, essentially. Basically, it adds to the riff. You can see that they're not like they're just small little hits that I've just kind of like duplicated, but they kind of add to the song when you listen to it in context. Because without this, it would sound like this. You can hear the difference when I add those counter riffs back in. And also, I have another counter riff here with Vital. And this essentially just gives it more like call and response for people to like chant and move their bodies to. And you can see I go even crazier in the second half, so you have this call here, and then there's a response, but the response is now in the counter melody, essentially. But you can see that I've essentially just kept it in this like mainline type of grid, because it kind of still works with the main flow, which is just this pseudo like quarter note flow. And the more that I stack these like flows on top of each other, especially with these like background elements here, which all of these are just basically chants from a bunch of games and stuff that I've just collected. And I've just ran it through reverb and OTT and some EQs. And I have a limiter here just to soften it up and also just aggressively push it, just so you can get those reverb tails out. Treating a limiter kind of like it was an aggressive compressor. Next thing I think probably people would be interested in is these fills. Fills are probably the backbone of how I make all the drops kind of work, because the fills kind of break the sections apart essentially, and they break the calls and responses from each other. So like one of my favorite fills is taking like a metal scream here and just chopping it up and duplicating it a bunch of times and just pitching it around. So I'll go into like the clip settings here. I'll go into the transposition here and just pitch it around and chop it up. And this is just, you can see like there's no processing on here. This is just a utility, and it's just completely raw audio. And I'm just basically taking the samples and just chopping them around and just leaving them in for like a little bits. But I think metal samples are really cool to use, and also these are my vocal samples also. So it's really cool to also use your own voice essentially as vocal chops or little vocal fills. Also little gunshots here, just to get the vibe even going more. You can tell there's a lot of like metal and violence in this music. And then we have this Reese right here. This is probably my favorite Reese. I call it the Coom Reese. Shout out Coom. And it's a pretty simple Reese. And it only requires just MIDI, like just a single note, and pitch bend automation. And it's the simplest sound. Obviously it's being ran through the reverb, but it is simply just a saw wave without its fundamental. You can see here. And then the fundamental, essentially. And I can control, essentially, the timing with this macro here. Essentially, it's detune. And I've set the width to 0, so it's completely mono. And then I can control, essentially, the speed of the resync. The amp is also like really helpful. The Ableton amp is really helpful because it really brings out the tone of the sound. Also just more compressors and stuff stacking on top of each other. Just removing mud here, distortion, and you can see like how I kind of stack stuff and just keep going and making the sound louder and more like abrasive, basically. Love OTT. And then here's the final EQ just to clean it up at the end here. And I have this 12, this 12 semitone pitch bend automation here. And you can see that I actually do some different automation in the second drop here. And you can hear that it actually has kind of a flow to the original metronome here. And I always try to keep my Reeses in time. So if you hear it kind of played in time like this. So you can see how I have the Reese in time there, and that took me like a while to get in time, but it just means like having to kind of finagle and even like stretching out this automation clip until you can kind of see like the size of it and really get the speed of it right. Because if you can get the speed of it right without any like LFOs or anything, you can kind of do anything. Who wants to hear the metal part?
The ability to create and manipulate sound waves of their own design.
Yeah, so this is probably my favorite part of writing this whole song, was the metal intro. I tried to keep the metal intro similar to the drop that you just heard before, basically. And so the way that I tried to do like metal and stuff and try to relate it to dubstep is I try to keep the same like riff and flow, but with the basic metal sounds, is what I like to call them. And for the sounds, I pretty much just use Contact. I usually synthesize them and I usually make them, but for this project, since I was on a time crunch and I'd also just gotten this laptop, so I had to basically make this whole thing from essentially scratch. And so I just wrote out the riffs as quick as I could, essentially. So we have guitar 1. We have layer 1, 2, and 3. And essentially all I did was I just took 3 different like presets and just tried to write out as much as I could, and you can see like I did a lot of velocity automation. And you can see that it's pretty basic writing. Like I just kind of just drew in like a bunch of 16th notes and just changed around so that it was kind of in line with the pseudo beat that I was going for. And for the drums, I also think I used a GG pack as well. Yeah, this is a sick drum kit. And I actually like rerouted it all actually back into Ableton so that I could actually remaster it actually and redo all the drum mixing myself, make it sound more like it was recorded in like a garage essentially, instead of like a giant metal kit. And also a really cool thing, if I open up here, I actually muted, I started doing a bus muting as well for like overheads and rides so that I can let certain stuff come through. So it's essentially like a full, like if like a robot played the drum set basically. And I was also like trying to make sure that I got all the drum MIDI actually correct so that it was physically possible to play. So I think this is physically possible to play. We can challenge someone to do that. Challenge Pat to do that. But essentially all I tried to do was write like the craziest like death metal, like speedcore intros like as I could. And you can hear how the kind of like the flow slash like what would I like to call it? The pulse changes up. You can hear how it's really fast here. And that's usually dictated by the cymbals. And I think most people, like, kind of, when they listen to metal, they listen to the cymbals kind of for the metronome. So I tried to, like, kind of write that, essentially. And you can hear kind of how that pulse changes up and changes the flow and really gives like that like really heavy headbanger feel, essentially. Then I went in here and added a bass guitar as well, which I think was a mix of, yeah, I froze it here so that it doesn't crash, but it's essentially just a contact instrument and a serum. And the serum is just a single sine wave at the fundamental, and then I remove the fundamental and the contact here. And I'm using Snap Heap here. Snap Heap is it's a really cool plugin that you can MIDI sidechain your MIDI input, essentially, and you can key track a filter, essentially. You can do that also, I think, in Pro Q, but I think I only knew how to do it in Snap Heap, so I didn't Snap Heap. It was super useful. And essentially this just creates a large mix, which I added some additional sounds, like just this crash right here, which is from Dr. Lobster. Just to really like make it sound like it's kind of like hard dancey, but also like hard dance mixed with metal. And then as for the vocal samples, I did a lot of recordings. I went and recorded these last minute at a friend's house, at Spell Thief's house. And so they essentially sound like this. So I just had to record those pretty quickly because I was like, I don't know anyone that can record metal vocals, but I can record metal vocals, so I'll just do it, I guess. So I recorded this first take right here. And I just wanted to aggressively clip into it, so I just pretty much like, I clipped right into this thing as hard as I could. And some tone came out of this, like it was just like the perfect take, I guess, and there was like a peak just like kind of came out here near 2K, and I was just like, that kind of sounds sick, I'm gonna run with it. But I also wanted to layer it so that it wasn't just completely mono, so I added a few takes here that were completely like left right here. And in these takes I used stuff like OTT and reverb and stuff to really bring out the sound. So like I have this layer here. Just kind of like scream apocalypse, scream choir-ish, you could say. And then when that layers up together with that sound, you get the mono sound and the stereo sound, and they all combine to create this basically like scream choir. And then for the next sound here, I do this quite a lot. If I don't want to completely like push my voice, since I'm not like a trained vocalist or anything, I will use the amp effect actually to get the screaming effect, essentially. And a way to do that is just like take some lemon juice down the throat. It's pretty easy. And just throw an amp on your voice and you can be a metal screamer. And of course, yeah, EQing it so that it's not like too harsh on the ear, but that it fits in the mix easily. And then just find a really cool riff that sounds really aggressive and just scream your heart out. I did some more screaming takes here. I don't know what I was saying, but I said some stuff just because it had a really cool like tonality and a really cool like flow to it. Additionally, I added some samples here. Just kind of like chanty stuff that people can kind of hear in the background and listen to. And then I just did a really quick like this scream here for the what is it called, the pre-job vocal. I think that's what it's called. That's what people call them. I just call it a vocal fill. And I just had to say like some weird phrase that kind of matched the name of the song, because originally I didn't have a name for the song. It was just called Neurogenesis, but then I called it The Revolution because I wanted to kind of split the tracks up from the intro. And yeah, I have just all these vocals kind of scattered throughout the track essentially. The Akvma tag, which is kind of notorious, everyone knows that. That was recorded by me. Akvma! Well, it's not the actual voice, but you get the idea. And I just took the Akvma tag and kind of just chopped it up around. So you can kind of get that little like glitchy sound that a lot of people kind of know me for. And then everything else is kind of just mostly intro cinematic stuff. I do pretty much a lot of my a majority of my stuff in my fills and atmospherics and stuff, building tension and shit. And so everyone's probably wondering like, what was this intro thing that you just created, and please explain this. This makes no sense. So essentially, I'm building this narrative here, and I'm trying to build like a story in your mind when you listen to this. And so I created this kind of like little intro. I just kind of threw it together last minute, but just taking the sound of like a loading VHS, I just went to like freesound.org and just downloaded a bunch of like sounds that kind of fit this like vibe. Especially like this jingle sound here.
Greetings, new Genesis user. Here at Angel
Love using
Corporation,
that.
we strive to make your world beautiful and attractive.
And also the door knocks here. Oh, I hope people don't get mad at me for the door knocks, because I panned them in such a way that they are
This program was created by
binaural.
our CEO and founder for the purposes of bettering the cosmos.
So I hope those don't scare you if you're wearing headphones, because I know this can be a little terrifying. But it's the idea of building up that atmosphere of tension and not sure like what's going on, but you're also trying to pay attention to that little main vocal in the beginning there as well, which can be off-putting. So when everything starts to really build up.
Creating your world today.
Oops. And then the atmosphere actually comes in and it reveals the true dark nature. And that's when the story really begins, essentially. And so you can kind of see how I've kind of named everything here. You can see I have like insert tape, intro jingle, hello new human employee. I'm kind of like, I write these little tags to kind of like inspire me and give myself ideas when I make these projects. It just have to be like drop or intro. It can be whatever it wants to be. It can be a full story. It can be a full story. It can be a whole new world. And you can also see like I use time signatures in a regular way to kind of space out everything in a certain way, and also just give like a structure to the entire project. especially like this part right here. It's not actually perfectly like in time, but it works narratively. Especially when you have all these building elements, like these low end sounds right here, this impact, a sub here, which is just rumbling here. A lot of these like glitching sounds here. And they add a lot of like texture and stuff, and a lot of ambience essentially. Especially like this hit and these little just kind of sounds that add all up together. Oh yeah, the little breaths. I meticulously placed those. All these little risers and stuff. Oh, and all these these fill effects up here are also really important. Kind of how I just went through Splice and just downloaded a bunch of sounds and pitched them around and started EQing them and fitting them into the atmosphere, and I ran them into this little reverb send here. Have like a crying child sound here. I think I reversed this one here so that it's pitched differently. And then yeah, it just goes into a lot of sounds here. Especially this, I like to call the neuro part. Where the really terrifying sounds come out. This is a sample coming out in a sample pack that I'm working on with Dr. Lobster. It's this little growl sound essentially. Ran through, I think, some other synths here. Just to create that tension and also add that dimension. And then this sound right here, which is probably the coolest sound I've made. It's a sine wave. Oops. And I ran it through just a ton of distortion and a ton of reverb, and it's all chained in a way that it essentially sounds like an engine kind of like moving, and it kind of adds that dimension of like we're going into an entirely like new environment here. I hope you guys enjoyed this and took something out of this. In the meantime, you should go check out my EP, Neurogenesis on Disciple.